Doug, let me throw it out to you first, because there's going to be a lot going on in Washington today, a lot of discussions, not just in the White House about what assistance they can give to France in this tragedy, but also in congressional leadership and the discussions around what the president has or hasn't done around Islamic State.
Yeah, I think you'll look at Congress talking about what the president should do and what the president has been doing, but in a way of how we can best help the French people. You'll see no divide between Republicans or between Republicans and Democrats. We'll be unified because this is just an awful attack, and it's very clear that we'll all move together forward for France, just as France stood behind us after the 9/11 attacks.
What usually happens at this point? I mean, you've been through many crises, Doug, I know, in your time in D.C. Walk me through the steps when a crisis like this hits. What goes on the Hill?
The first thing is you gather the facts. You want to know what happened, when it happened, and then how it happened. So we're already seeing from the news reports exactly what happened. We're learning more every minute. That's why you're seeing members of Congress and leadership starting to talk about, certainly, we stand with France. These attacks are appalling. But that's the preliminary. We still want to know more. We still want to find out exactly what happened so we can figure out how to prevent these things in the future, but also demonstrating the whole time that we stand with France and we stand with the leadership of France. We've seen strong leadership already with President Hollande already on the scene, and that's important for the French president to show that leadership.
Right, absolutely no divide today, no partisanship at all.
And, you know, this is amazing. I'm just watching the Twitter feed from Le Monde this morning. They have an email from, he's a researcher. He's very close to the editorial staff of Charlie Hebdo. Jean-Yves Camus, he wrote, all of the men I know are dead. This is something that we have never seen in the history of our country. An organ of the press is methodically decimated after a military attack. There have been attacks, there have been fire bombings on Charlie Hebdo, but this is unprecedented. I want to talk a little bit about the politics of this. You know, we have seen already in the last 5 years a rise in far-right parties. It's actually impossible to even call them far-right parties anymore because they're becoming increasingly mainstream. A party like the Front National, which in the 90s, you know, could command possibly 10% of the vote, is now climbing upwards, and we're seeing that across Europe, but particularly in France. Cass Sunstein, I know this is not the heart of the research that you do, but one of the things that's interesting to me is watching these parties. They're tied into anti-EU sentiment, but also anti-immigration sentiment. These are two things in Europe that have been twinned for the last decade.
Right. Well, there are a couple of things probably to separate. One is there's a sense in the part of some who are struggling of grievance, partly because of difficult economic circumstances, partly because of persistent sense of subordination in some way or another. Mm-hmm. And then that's a problem, and it needs to get a target for people who are suffering in that way. Mm-hmm. And the target may be a political target, that is immigration. The other issue, I think, to get a focus on in its relationship to terrorist acts remains to be determined, but is if like-minded people who do have an acute sense of grievance or outrage are talking to one another, then they can gear each other up towards great extremism, and in the terrible case, literal violence.
That's fascinating. You know, this is where we're going to bring this up on the screen. Actually, we're looking at the growth in far-right political parties all over Europe. Can you bring that up? We're talking about you know, Syriza and Podemos. Okay, well, we can take a look at it in a second. But one of the things I spoke, you know, last year to Catherine DeVries, she's a scholar at Oxford, and she calls these parties entrepreneurial parties, which is that these grievances that you're talking about, they've been sitting around waiting for somebody to seize on politically.
Yes, well, there's an idea actually of polarization entrepreneurs, they're called, and these are people who try to foment polarization by focusing on a set of people identifiable along ethnic or other lines, maybe even sociological lines, who have a grievance, who should be polarizing themselves, meaning getting more extreme, more politically engaged, more outrage, creating something new. And of course, civil rights movements, sometimes of the best and most honorable kinds, have been created by polarization entrepreneurs, as they're called. So it can be a well-functioning part of a democracy, very important. The danger is when it's based on falsehood, when it's based on kind of hatred, when the political innovations that are sought aren't helping anybody.
And you can't discount what is going on in the French economy and how that foments some of that discontent with youth unemployment in the double digits, how that can lead to some of the affiliations with the extremist views.